Hi everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 19 in the podcast series. I'm calling this one Knit Together, and I'll explain about why in a few minutes. You can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, Instagram and Ravelry, on YouTube, obviously, and on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com. And this episode has a bunch of travel-related knitting and fiber type things. And then towards the end, I want to get back to that knit together idea, and hopefully some of you will want to get involved. So I am coming to you from New York, Ithaca, New York, actually between Ithaca and Trumansburg. And the last time I did a podcast out here, a bunch of folks wrote in and said, oh my gosh, I used to live in Ithaca, or I know Trumansburg, or it's such a beautiful area. It's the Finger Lakes area of New York. So it's a nice place to be. And I talk about it specifically in one of the earlier podcasts about place and why I really like being here. But this has been a kind of wild summer for us. The last time I podcasted, I had just finished my Ella cardigan, and that was kind of before we hit the road and went to Montana and Colorado and then back to Illinois and back to New York. So it's been a little bit of a road trip summer, which is always good for knitting because I get a lot of knitting done in the car usually. This last couple trips it's been almost like a little bit of a knitting break, which is something I never do. In the last 5 or 6 years of knitting, I pretty much knit like 24/7, 365 days a year. But this summer has been a little bit of a rest on the hands and a rest on the brain, and that's been really nice. But don't worry, I've still been knitting and spinning and thinking about fiber. So travel-related stuff. We went to the mountains in Montana, and I'll put a few pictures in here. We did some backpacking in the wilderness, and for those of you who don't know what wilderness backpacking is, it's pretty much like completely roughing it. Like we bring a tent to sleep in, some sleeping bags, pads for the ground. We carry all of our food in bear canisters because it's bear country out there. And we basically just carry all of our stuff with us out into the wilderness, and we saw no people for 7 days. It was pretty amazing. And climbed a lot of massive snowy scree fields and crossed some rivers, and it was just beautiful out there, really quiet and very few bugs. Had some great conversations, slept in the crisp mountain air, all that kind of good stuff. So that was really fun. And on our last day as we were hiking out, or second to last day as we were hiking out, we were taking a break for a second, and I looked up on one of the cliffs. I was like, oh my gosh, my son was out there with us. I said, Zach, look at that beautiful waterfall up there. And he said, hey mama, look at the mountain goats. So in our Montana travels, we managed to find some fiber animals. There was a mama mountain goat and a baby up on the cliff, and I'll put some pictures in here so you can see it. I put some up on the blog too. And a couple last year when we went out there, we actually found kind of followed some mountain goats around. It was later in the season, and they were shedding. I don't know if it's ruiing, if it's the same kind of thing as Shetlands do, but anyway, they were shedding their fur, and so I was collecting little bits and pieces of mountain goat fluff out in the mountains, and I have a little baggie of it back in my yarn room that I'm still waiting to spin. So fiber out in the wilderness, awesome. And then when we got back to civilization, we took a trip quick down through Yellowstone to Colorado to visit Spencer's family. And I got to go to one of my favorite yarn stores. It was great to see his family. Hi family, you guys are awesome. But I got to visit one of my favorite yarn stores, which is Shuttle Spindles and Skeins in Boulder, Colorado. Massive store, amazing stuff. For me, one of the best things about their store is that it's 2 shops big. So it's like the one shop right when you walk in is all yarn and books and supplies and fiber and anything you can imagine. And then right next door, through a little doorway, is their massive classroom. They have tons of weaving supplies. They have looms set up you can try. A huge classroom in the back. When I was there was a weaving lesson going on in the back. And my favorite thing about their store, their yarn is pretty good, yarn selection wise. They don't have a lot of local stuff, but that's okay. It's like if you needed yarn for a project, tons of yarn to choose from. But their library is really amazing. Magazines going back like decades. They have Spin-Off, they have Ply, Wild Fiber, which is, every time I go there, there's like a new one that I find. Piecework, you know, all the great magazines for knitting are all there. And then their library is like an entire alcove of the store is just full of books, you know, categorized by different things. Like if you're looking for sweaters or socks, or if you're a crocheter, or if you're looking for weaving books or spinning books. I mean, it's like, I sat there, I think the first time I went into the shop, I sat there for 2 or 3 hours reading books and just finding books I had never seen before. And this time as well, it's kind of the first thing I do when I go in there is really check out all their books. Because they have stuff that I can't even find at either library in New York or in Illinois, or on Amazon, or anywhere else I've looked. So I brought a couple things. I only bought one thing in the store, which I was kind of surprised about. But I also found another book in the store that, and I usually don't do this, but I ordered it on, I found a used version of it from Goodwill on the internet. But I found the book in their store. So this is their adorable little card in case of interest. So if you're ever out in Boulder, Colorado, go check out Shuttle Spindles and Skeins, especially if you're a weaver or if you're interested in like massive amounts of books and magazines. Great place to go. What I did pick up at their shop is this really cool book that comes from a series. It's part of the Hochberg series. So they have other books like called Fiber Facts and like the Hand Spinner's Handbook, and then Hand Spindles. But this one is the Spin Span Spun. And I picked it up because it's just really neat, like just folklore and history tidbits about knitting and spinning. And weaving, things like that. So it just, you know, some really interesting, not all of it's true, of course, but it's kind of like folklore about knitting, different kind of old stories, ideas about where things came from, why we do things the way we do things, you know, some really cool history from around the world, like kind of an international history that goes all the way up to some of the riots at the mills, Distaff Day, you know, stuff about England, stuff about Iran, stuff from the Middle Ages, all the way up. So it's just a really cool, I love spinning and knitting histories, and I've never seen this kind of thing before. Of course, it's something that you would find at Shuttle Spindles and Skeins. And so that was really cool. And then the book that I found there that I decided to try to find a used copy of is Knitting Socks with Hand-Painted Yarn. And maybe you guys are familiar with this. I have a bin of hand-painted sock yarn at home because I love supporting indie dyers, as you know. And number one, I like supporting indie dyers. Number two, I like knitting socks. And number three, they're just beautiful objects to have these skeins of yarn. But the tricky thing for most of you, as you know, if you've ever tried to knit with hand-painted yarn, is that you can end up with things like color pooling, and just trying to figure out how to, you know, textured patterns don't always work with hand-painted yarns because you lose the texture because of the color changes, and you don't want to always make vanilla socks. So it's kind of like, it's catch-22. Beautiful skeins, support indie dyers. What do you do with them? This is the book for you. And I've been looking for a book like this for a long time, and again, I don't see things like this in my libraries, and on Amazon. I hadn't looked back far enough. This book came out in, came out in 2008, so it's not even that old. It's about 8 years old. And it's Carol Sokolsky, and I don't know her as an author, but her patterns are pretty cool. The patterns in here tend toward trying to break up the color. So trying to avoid things like color pooling in different interesting ways. And I was going to show you, this is one of my favorite ones. It's the flame socks, where you'd use kind of a basic black as the background and then use your hand-painted yarn to create a kind of flame motif in your sock. And there are some in here. This is a more traditional sock that you might see with hand-painted yarns, where you're using just basic color work, right? To kind of break up the colors. But then there's some funky stuff. And this reminds me of like General Hogbuffer's socks. So thinking about knitting in different kinds of directionality. Because when you knit in different directions, the length of your of yarn that it takes to get around for your color repeats changes. So you're less likely to have pooling happen. And there was one other one in here that I was going to show you. Let's see if I can find it. This is a pretty good example too. This one gets you some textured stitches. But in the textured part, you see you're changing the amount of yarn that it takes to get around versus the foot. And so you're changing your color pooling. So really awesome book. I got this one online, I think from Amazon, but it was from a used copy. You know, Amazon kind of aggregates stuff. So this is from a Goodwill. Ironically enough, as I flipped through the book, it's from a Goodwill from someone who used to shop at the Stitchin' Den, because this was inside the book. And I looked up the Stitchin' Den, and the Stitchin' Den is in Estes Park, Colorado, I think, or in Wyoming, one or the other. Oh no, the Goodwill was in Wyoming. Stitch's Den is in Colorado, I think at Estes Park. And so I went to Colorado, I found the book, I went home and ordered it from a Goodwill in Wyoming from a woman who used to go to the Stitchin' Den in Colorado. Small world, right? Great book. Especially if you're interested in sock knitting and hand-painted yarns. And speaking of sock knitting, I've been working away on my test knit for Anna of the Dunkelgrün Podcast. And Anna gave a sweet shout out on one of her last podcasts, so thank you so much, Anna. That was really sweet to hear. I've been working on her sock. She said her pattern is going to be posted, she thinks, at the end of this month. And I can share because she's been sharing the actual photos of the pattern on social media. So I'm going to show you the test knit of one of the socks. This is how it came out. And I don't have my sock blockers, but this pattern actually just lends itself well to being held up, and it looks good. So amazing cables on the top, some awesome color work in the heel section, and then a cool toe, round toe. Beautiful socks. I love the way they came out. The texture of them is just really, really cool. I think that the camera is picking up on it. And so I'm working away on my second sock for Anna, and I'm at the heel flap, and when I'm back in the car, I think when I will have some more time for the knitting. I will finish off that sock, and then when she releases her pattern, I think she's going to link to all of us who are test knitters for finished objects. And there have been some really cool finished objects in the test knit thread. People doing all kinds of really interesting color work, different mismatched socks, where one sock is one version of the color on the pattern and the other is a different kind of mirror opposite. I've just seen some really cool stuff. And the pattern is excellent, so when it does come out, I would highly recommend it. And you can see that it's like a really fun knit in that you get all of your cabled, kind of textured work in the sock, but you also have some fun color work, and it's just 3 colors, and you only need a little bit of a couple of the colors, so you can use your scraps for this kind of thing. And it turns out into like just a beautiful sock. It's really interesting to knit, all the different parts of it, and then when you wear it, it just has a lot of visual appeal. So way to go, Anna. Awesome sock, awesome pattern, and I look forward to supporting more of your patterns and promoting them as much as I can. I also have been working, the little bit of knitting time that I've been working on my brioche knitting, actually, in part because, you know, this is like, I love to learn new things, and I've done a lot of color work this year, a bunch of sweaters and cardigans, and just trying, you know, different kinds of things. And then brioche has been on my list for a long time. And one of the knits that I want to do this fall is the Rebel 2 shawl, which is from Knit Graffiti Designs. I'll show it up here. And the Rebel 2 shawl is a brioche shawl. Really cool. I talked about it a couple podcasts ago, and I know that Tommy Trujillo of the Squirrel Pie Productions podcast is also thinking about knitting this shawl. I kind of think maybe we should do a little knit along there, Tommy. Tommy, if you're watching, let's talk. So I wanted to get some brioche skills before I undertook the knitting of the shawl, even though the pattern pretty much says that you'd be okay, and I just dropped everything on the floor. The pattern pretty much says you'd be okay with minimal knowledge of brioche, but I just don't feel quite comfortable with that. It's like a 2-color brioche shawl that's got some increases and decreases, so I needed to learn the basics. So what I did is I signed up for and took Nancy Marchant's Craftsy class on brioche knitting. And Nancy Marchant, for those of you who have done brioche, she's kind of like the brioche maven. One of the main books on brioche that came out was her book. She has a Craftsy class, and she talks about in the Craftsy class kind of like seeing these stitches when she was traveling and then going back home and trying to recreate them and figure out what they were and kind of giving them a name in a certain kind of mainstream context, I guess. I mean, this kind of knitting has been going on for years, and some of you may know more of the history of brioche knitting than I do, and I'd love to hear in the comments on this video like more about brioche and where it came from and what you know about it, so please share. So I've been taking the Craftsy class, which is fairly excellent. I like taking Craftsy classes where you're learning a new technique, not just kind of making a pattern, which is fine, but where you're learning some new techniques, because for me, I'm a visual learner and I like to learn with people, new stitches and things. I can't really, my husband is like a book learner. He can pick up a book and like learn something new just from pictures. I am not that kind of learner. And so taking the Craftsy classes is always really helpful to me. And this class is a particularly good class in that she goes over not only basic brioche, just 1-color brioche, and like how you do the stitches, the increases, decreases, basic brioche, all that kind of stuff. But then she does 2-color brioche, which is what I needed to know for the shawl. And she goes over things like how to read the charts and tips and techniques for like when things go wrong, because they inevitably will. And I just find her, she's a little bit brusque kind of in her manner, but she gets the job done. And so I really appreciate her way of teaching. There are a couple things about the class that I noticed. One is that I would follow along with her and try to do the stitches and use the 30-second repeat and learn the stitches. But then translating between the stitches and reading the actual pattern that's in the course materials, that was a little bit difficult. So I ended up practicing by watching. Then I went to the pattern and tried to like compare like which stitch is which and how's it being, because it's a whole different language in terms of knitting. The ways that, it's like reading another, I don't know, it's not quite like reading another language because you have a lot of the basics, but there's new, it's like a dialect. There's like new terms and different kinds of twists that you wouldn't quite recognize. So kind of going back and forth between the video and the pattern, and then just thinking about it on my own, like as I knit, trying to read my stitches and figure out what I should do next. Because in her instruction, she'll give you the stitch, but then there are like certain little moments where it's like the yarn needs to be in front or it needs to be in back or it needs to be, you know, in a certain kind of place. And if you don't catch it in the video and then you make a stitch, it's not quite right and you have to kind of play around with it to get it to work. So I thought through that trial and error, those stages of trial and error, I finally got to a good sense of brioche knitting. So this is the sampler that I've been working on for the class. Hold it up here. I think that's coming in. Yes. Okay, so down here is just regular old brioche knitting. And one of the cool things about brioche knitting is that it kind of has a light side and a dark side. And on the dark side, it pretty much repeats the light side, but just in a cool kind of way, right? In like a reverse mirror kind of way. And then this part here is called syncopation or syncopated brioche knitting. So you're kind of bringing the green, the opposite color to the front, and then dropping the light color to the back, and the same thing kind of happens in the back. And then I did a little bit more regular brioche knitting, and then I started my increases and my decreases to create this long leaf pattern. And you can see right down here I messed up. And I changed a lot of I went back and corrected a lot of my mistakes, but here you can see 3 mistakes. And I had, like I said, I've been kind of going back and correcting most of my mistakes as I went, because like I would realize what went wrong and kind of like play around with it until it went right. But I wanted to leave those 3 in because it was a good reminder that as you're going along, it's really helpful to think about why something went wrong. And in this case, I was working on a right-leaning I was working on resolving a right-leaning increase. So I created the increase the row before, and then as I was going across with the green color, the dark color, I was trying to resolve the 3-stitch increase that I had created, 3 of the stitches. And instead of, this is one of those minor things, instead of putting my yarn to the back to slip the first stitch and then bringing it to the front again to purl the second stitch, I just didn't know that that's what needed to happen. So I left the yarn in front when I slipped the stitch, and that creates this kind of issue here, these 3 stitches, rather than what should happen, which happens in all the other increases, that you just see the light color, right? Pretty interesting stuff. And it's taken me, this hasn't taken long. This has taken about a week on and off as we've been traveling and seeing family and stuff to get this going. And I feel much more comfortable with brioche now, both regular brioche. Syncopation I'm not as clear on, but I think I get it. And then the increases and decreases make a lot of sense to me. So now I'm ready to go tackle that shawl, because the shawl has a lot of this kind of increase, decrease business and 2-color brioche. So I'm super excited about that. And if anybody else is trying to learn brioche, I would highly recommend that Craftsy class with Nancy Marchant. And just recommend playing around. I just pulled out 2 balls of my Knit Picks Wool the Andes to just play around with, and a set of double-pointed needles, because you need to be able to slide your whole thing back and forth depending on which color you're working. So I was just like, let's play, let's have some fun, and just brought out some yarn, light in the dark, and it's been really great to just play around with something. I've been knitting so many sweaters and garments and like big objects that take a lot of time, and this has just been cool. It's like, oh, I can just sit here and play with some stitches and some yarn and just see what happens and make mistakes and come back around and try to fix them, and it's been a really interesting learning process. So I would highly recommend it if anybody's interested in the brioche learning, to check out that class. And I will keep you updated on the shawl, because I have all the stuff with me here in New York, and I think I'll cast that on sooner than later, hopefully. Okay, so in the last segment of this show for today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the theme of knit together. So you guys know I love community building. It's one of the things I do on my blog all the time, trying to feature indie artists and fiber spinners and anyone else, in the community who's working with fiber and trying to create something cool. And so right now, I know the Copper Cave Fiber Festival is going on in Montana, and that's Cami Noise. And I was really hoping to get out there, but Montana it's like a 1 trip a year kind of thing for me. And we were there earlier in the season. And I know that in a couple weeks, Sarah of Fiber Track is hosting a retreat up in Maine, which sounds amazing. So there are a lot of really cool folks out there in the community trying to bring people together and do some interesting kinds of work and sharing and learning. There's also, in case you guys don't know this, there are like tons of other shadow communities, like YouTube communities, subcultures, that are doing a lot of other community building in interesting ways. So my husband's a YouTuber, and he just makes tons of cool videos about just making things. Like he just made the longest hammock chain he could on our farm, and he built a shelter out in the backwoods, and he's building constantly and making and reviewing and doing really fun stuff. And because of this, he's gotten involved in a couple different communities, and one of them is kind of like a maker community this one guy, I think it's Jimmy DeResta, I think I'm saying that right, made an ice pick. This is the ice pick. I have it right now in my hand. It's kind of cool. Spencer's about to send it off to the next YouTuber, but I happen to have it. And the idea was that he made this ice pick and he sent it off to one YouTuber, and the idea was that YouTuber would then make a video about it, doing something with it, something about it, blah, 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 and then hand it on to the next YouTuber. And so here's the actual ice pick. I'll pull it out. And it's a beautiful object that he made. And it's kind of like funky in that you think about ice picks as being a very outmoded, outdated kind of technology. But, to have a beautiful handcrafted one is kind of cool. So all these YouTubers are getting this ice pick in sequence, doing something with it, making a video about it, and it's kind of building this little community in the maker subculture of YouTube. So it really got me thinking, after my husband made his version of the video, if there was something equivalent that us knitters could do, not necessarily equivalent, because I went through like all of our technologies that we use. Could we send each other bobbins? Could we send each other, we always send each other skeins of yarn, and then something beautiful gets made from them. But I was trying to think, like, is there something else we could do as a community that would be kind of interesting in this same kind of way? And what I came up with is this Knit Together project. And what I'd love to do, if folks are interested, is I was going to send out some pairs of DPN needles, just like maybe to 3 or 5 different podcasters or viewers who are interested. And what I'd love us to do is, if you get the needles, you make a blanket square. And I'll put all the specs up on the blog about how this might work, what kind of blanket square you could make. And I want these blanket squares to have something special for the maker. So either it's a local fiber, it's a fiber you spun yourself, it's knit from a skein of yarn that you dyed yourself, something that matters to you. And you make a blanket square, and then you send me the blanket square, and you send the needles on to somebody else. And if you get tagged with the needles, you make a blanket square, and all the squares come back to me. And I will, as many squares as we get, I'll see how many blankets we can make. Maybe it'll be 1, maybe it'll be 2, maybe it'll be 10, I don't know. We'll see how creative you guys get and how big our community, what 6 degrees of separation is within the community. And I will seam up the blanket, and whoever sent a square in will be entered in the giveaway to win one of the finished blankets. That way it's kind of like, these are really neat objects. Everybody has a kind of stake in making them, and the blankets themselves carry all kinds of stories about local fiber, about things that are special to us, different stories of fiber and yarn and things like that. And then one of the makers who has been involved in this knit together will get a blanket in the end, which seems kind of cool to me. So if you're interested in getting involved, I'm going to send out, I think 3 to 5 pairs of needles to some folks that I know. I'm thinking of tagging Sarah of Fiber Trek, Rachel of the Treehouse Knits podcast, and Tommy of Squirrel Pie Productions, just right off the bat. Maybe Helen of Crocraft Beasties if she's interested, but that's all the way in Ireland, so I don't know. Maybe we can go international. Rachel of the Wool and Spinning podcast, Kate of Hawthorne Cottage Craft podcast. All those folks, if they're interested, could help this become beyond the United States, out into England and Ireland, Canada. It could be really cool. So we'll see what happens with that. But if you're interested in getting involved and you're not tagged in this initial podcast, you can always PM me on Ravelry and send me your specs, and I can send you an address to send your blanket square to. So everybody can get involved. If you're tagged, so much the better. If you're not, it's awesome. Whoever sends in a blanket square will be entered into the giveaway to win the final finished object. So, our knit along. I hope everybody will participate and get excited about knitting something together for our knitting community, and having a kind of visible representation of how much we're connected to each other. Just like those makers who are passing the ice pick around, we can be a bunch of makers who create something communal together. So I think it'll be kind of cool, and I'm ready to send out my DPNs to whoever's interested, and then have them sent off into the world. That is about it for today. So I hope everybody's having fun and enjoying the summer, and maybe traveling, maybe staying home. When I get back to good Wi-Fi, which will be soon, I can't wait to catch up on all your podcasts and all of your makings and doings. So yeah, it's going to be a good rest of the summer. And I will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for tuning in. Take care. Bye-bye.